1776. Let's do this. So I was originally going to tell you a little bit about the book Common Sense, the pamphlet that was published by Thomas Paine in January of 1776. But guess what? I made a whole different video on that. So not necessary to go into too much detail here. You can check that one out. But I'll just remind you that it was published in January of 1776. Paine himself wasn't from the colonies. He came to America from Britain in 1774. He was a political theorist and a philosopher, and he really embraced all those Enlightenment ideals. And this pamphlet reached to a lot of the people who were actually against the the revolution, maybe because they were loyalists, or maybe just because they weren't that impassioned about it. They didn't really care. They were apathetic. But within weeks, it spread throughout the colonies. And John Adams said that the revolution was really won in the people's minds before the war even began. This helped make that possible. But FYI, Adams wasn't a big fan of Paine. He thought he wasn't a fan of his writing style. But his writing style did appeal to people's widespread convictions. It was not haughty, deep philosophy. And actually, he used a lot of language from the New Testament. And remember, we just learned about the Great Awakening. A lot of people latched on to that. Now, I will tell you that where he published Common Sense, it's now a parking lot. They preserved Independence Hall. They preserved the Betsy Ross House. They preserved so many things, but it's a parking lot. A parking lot. Like, couldn't they have at least made it one of the places that makes really good Philadelphia cheesesteaks? Couldn't Jim's have just opened another place there, a parking lot? Come on, Philly. Do better. Do better. Right, so let's get to it, to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia of spring of 1776. Now, England was embargoing all trade to the colonies, and they were seizing ships, and this really fast-forwarded the movement for the Americans to debate independence. Congress declared that all of its ports were open to ships of all countries, not just British ships. And soon enough, you get the first call for independence. And that first call was here to our left, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. So he called for independence on June 7th of 1776. And later he becomes the president of the Congress Confederation. He even becomes a senator under the Constitution from 1789 to 1792. Now, they realized that, okay, well, if we're going to declare independence, we need a committee to draft this declaration, right? They didn't have it just waiting in the wings. So there was a committee, of which Thomas Jefferson, as you see here, was one of them. So he was made the chair of the committee. And a group, who you're going to hear about shortly, presented their draft in June 28th. Now, we'll learn that many of the parts of the original draft were taken out, namely the parts about slavery. And trust me, we're going to get into that in class. The final version was voted for on July 2nd. 12 delegations voted. So like 12 different states, if you will. Now, what state didn't vote was New York. Now remember, there are a lot of loyalists in New York, and you're going to hear more about that as well. But they didn't vote against it. They just abstained from the voting. Therefore, it was a unanimous vote, right? That was clever. That was done on purpose. By July 4th, it's sent to the printer. And on July 8th, it's read outside Philadelphia, outside Independence Hall. And the people were cheering, and in true Philadelphian fashion, they stormed Independence Hall and started ripping all the British coat of arms inside. This was like a courthouse, right? So they were just removing all signs of British authority away from it. That's very Philadelphia for you, right? All right, so let's learn a little bit more about the Declaration and who really wrote it anyway. Speaking of the Declaration, do you know that the Declaration wasn't like this highly regarded thing for many years? Afterwards, and it wasn't really until I'd say about 50 years after the Declaration was signed and then the war's over and the Constitution is finally ratified that people reflected back on the Declaration. And that is really shown in this great book, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson by Gordon Wood. And it goes how they were, sort of friends that worked together during the Revolution. Then they were like frenemies in the Washington administration and afterwards. And then in their old age, they rekindled that friendship again. And this talks a little bit about that propaganda machine as to why we think more about Jefferson and the Declaration than the others who were also involved in its creation. As the signers of the Declaration of Independence died off, more and more attention were paid to the survivors. In fact, Jefferson and Adams kept a tally of who among the signers were still alive. When Robert R. Livingston died in 1813, Adams and Jefferson became the last two survivors of the committee that had drafted the Declaration. Benjamin Franklin had died in 1790 and Roger Sherman in 1793. And it goes on how, like, in their letters, they're like, oh, like, how many of us are left as they're communicating towards the end of their life. Conscious of himself as the principal author of the Declaration, Jefferson was obviously more interested in the document and its signers than Adams. Initially, he and others had not made much of the preamble or his authorship. Attention at first focused on the document's conclusion that these United colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, right? But more people memorize the preamble, not that, today. Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration was not widely known. Indeed, one of the first references to his writing the Declaration was made by Yale College president Ezra Stiles in 1783, in which he said that Jefferson had poured the soul of the continent into the monumental act of independence. During the 1780s, Jefferson was mentioned as one of the members of the committee that drafted the Declaration, but he was not singled out and celebrated as the author. Jefferson himself actually helped draw attention to the significance of the Declaration. And then it goes on to show how Jefferson sort of had a campaign to get recognition as almost sole, even though he wasn't a sole author of the Declaration. And we discussed that, on his tombstone, it lists some of his biggest accomplishments. It doesn't list that he was president of the United States, but it does list that he was the author of the Declaration. So, something to think about. So, the war is underway, and the British headquarters were just right across the river in New York City. In 1776, Washington, leading the Continental Army, tried to challenge the British hold in New York, but failed. And in late October, it remained by then in British hands until the end of the war. And we are going to understand that, some people will say sort of snootily, like, Washington lost more battles than he won. Yeah, but Washington won the war, and he realized what it would take to win the war. And it wouldn't necessarily being to win all these battles, but to prolong the war and to make it costly. He knew that that is what would lead to victory. And he was right. That's the strategy that worked. So the war is now underway. The British are in New York City, and the king sends over. Hey, where's my next slide? Here we go. The British send over two brothers, and we have General William Howe on the left and Admiral Richard Howe on the right. And they tried to reconcile at first with the colonies. They're like, "Hey, let's stop. Let's work this out. All that we demand is that the first thing you need to do is to revoke that Declaration of Independence that you just made." And the colonists are like, no, too late. Sorry. Let's do this. And let's be honest, Washington was not made for this kind of frontal combat. We learned about him noticing in the French and Indian War that combat wasn't going to be successful. So he used all these different strategies to prolong the war, to make it costly. He needed new tactics to fight this war. He had to protect civilians, right, while avoiding major battles. And in September of 1777, the British took Philadelphia. So that's not good, right? So, how do we recover from that? Well, eventually we recover in October of 1777 when the Americans won at Saratoga in New York. I'll have another video just on that for you because I visited Saratoga and took some footage for you guys. And this was a gentleman's surrender, and which meant that the British would not be attacked as they left. And General Burgoyne had to surrender over 5,000 British soldiers there. But let's back up for a second here. This fighting in New York was serious, right? You had so many people there who were loyalists, and you had issues getting supplies in with the British occupying New York, and so many issues. So let's talk a little bit about what to do. The first option, maybe burning Manhattan. Now that the British occupy New York City, what to do with it, right? How do the Americans respond? And this book, Washington's Spies, the story of America's first spy ring, is a really interesting book about the network of spies that Washington had. And it's by Alexander Rode, and there's actually a TV series based on it. So it gets into all the spying and how they spied and all their different techniques. And I can talk to you more about that, and even some of my family who were spies on Staten Island, if you're interested. But now, what to do? Washington and his commanders furiously debated what to do with the abandoned city. The New Englanders wanted to burn it, so as to leave the British with nothing but a blackened husk in which to spend the approaching winter. The New Yorkers, sensibly enough, were reluctant to raise their own property. General Nathanael Greene, a Rhode Islander, favored burning. In a lengthy letter to Washington, he laid out the purely military justification for doing so. The city and island of New York are no objects for us. Part of the army already has met with a defeat. The country is struck with a panic. Any capital loss at this time may ruin the cause. 2/3 of the property of the city of New York and the suburbs belong to the Tories. We have no very great reason to run considerable risk for its defense. I would burn the city and the suburbs, and that for the following reasons. If the enemy gets possession of the city, we never can recover the possession without a superior naval force to theirs. It will deprive the enemy of an opportunity of barracking their whole army together. It would deprive them of a general market. The price of things would prove a temptation to our people to supply them for the sake of gain and direct violations of the laws of their country. It goes on, but basically, there were a lot of people who wanted just to burn New York City down as they were on the way out. It didn't happen, right? But it was close. Okay, so burning Manhattan turns out to not be an option, and probably for good reason. But that doesn't mean that, okay, everything's fine in Manhattan, in New York, Staten Island, Long Island, that whole area. It becomes a really tense area for people, families, people who were involved in the war and who could care less for years to come. Here's a little story about that. So it's important to understand, especially in this area around New York and New Jersey, how when the British occupied New York and just how many loyalists there were in this area, right? There were a lot of people who supported the British and not the Patriot cause for a super long time, and all the different tensions that caused. And even if you didn't feel strongly one way or the other, how difficult it made life, how you needed a pass even just to get around certain places. And that may be even split up families. A lot of this is illustrated in this book, Generous Enemies, Patriots and Loyalists in Revolutionary New York. And it goes through all these tensions and this timeline. It's by Judith L. Van Buskirk, and she's a historian who's friends with one of my historian friends. So just a short passage. The British, for their part, regularly described atrocities committed by the Americans, particularly on those loyalists caught in the enemy territory. The more horrific the rumor, the better. In May 1778, the New York City newspapers reported that 2 men were crucified in Dutchess County for attempting to join the British forces. In another story, a loyalist ventured into the country in order to bring his family back to New York. En route, a party of rebels stopped him, strapped him to a tree, and unloaded their muskets into his body. So you see, this is just one of the many disturbing ways that the war was fought um, amongst people of the area. Okay, so I think you have a pretty good understanding of things right at the beginning of 1776. You have people fueled and fired up by common sense. You have the committee to make the declaration's signed, people are fired up, let's go. But the British occupy New York and they realize this war is not going to be easy and we're going to have to employ some new tactics in order to make it successful. So next we're going to get into, well, how is this government going to run anyway? We declared independence, but now what? How are we going to function? What's our structure going to be? And in comes the Articles of Confederation. And that's what you got going up next. So stay tuned.